Welcome to the latest instalment of the Talent Waste podcast. I'm making my debut today, deputising for my business partner, Lee McQueen. So I wanted to really introduce what the podcast is going to be about today, what we're talking about in terms of talent waste as a concept, and I'm going to introduce you to our very special guest today, Tinu Cornish. So here at Phoenix 51, we are on a mission to try and understand the concept of what we have deemed talent waste. Now, talent waste, what we've deemed is when individuals in an organisation leave prematurely. So that may be for reasons around poor hiring decisions, poor culture, perhaps a lack of training and development opportunities within an organisation. And there's some really interesting statistics that have come out of CIPD and the Office for National Statistics, stating that 30 to 45% of employees leave within the first year of their organisation. And we think that's really interesting in terms of the cost that that's having within an organisation, both directly and indirectly. And so we're looking to speak to industry experts across the talent sphere to really understand more about the concept of talent waste and see what strategies organisations and people are putting into place to try to essentially solve this problem. So I'll do a quick introduction, as I've not been on this before. So I'm Chris Wimshurst. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Phoenix 51. My background is I worked within the talent sector for 12 years before taking my leave and retraining as a business psychologist. So the work that I do is I work with organisations around talent strategy, around people. I do a lot of one-to-one coaching and working with organisations around things like culture, talent and people. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to pass you over to the wonderful Tinu, who is an industry expert in the world of diversity and inclusion. She's a chartered organisational psychologist and is going to be really getting into the detail around diversity and inclusion on today's session. Tinu, hi, nice to meet you.
Hi, thank you, Chris. So like Chris said, I'm a chartered organisational psychologist. So that means that I'm interested in the science of how people think, feel and behave at work. But with my 35 years equality, diversity and inclusion experience, I'm very interested in bringing the power of psychology to help organisations and individuals and teams and leaders really understand how we can measurably move the dial when it comes to EDI. I work across all the sectors, that's ranged from working with leading professional services firms, the government, for example, the Government Commercial Office, major higher education institutions, and the not-for-profit sector. So, for example, the International Rescue Committee is an example of one I've been working with this year. So basically across all of the different sectors.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Tinu. So we're going to jump straight into it in terms of looking at, I guess, the impact of equality, diversity and inclusion on the concept of talent waste. So before we get into, I guess, maybe concepts around talent acquisition or talent management, I thought we could talk about, first of all, really just defining what actually inclusion is and why does it matter?
Right. So inclusion, often when we think of inclusion, we think it's about ensuring that people feel that they belong, that they feel that they are equal and an accepted member of their particular group, whether it's their team, whether it's their organisation. And yes, that's really important, that people feel that they've got an equal opportunity, that if they make a contribution, that it is recognised and valued and accepted. But I think also what the psychology tells us is that they need to be able to do that whilst being their unique self. So they shouldn't have to feel that the only way that they can be included, the only way that they can be heard, is if they become a clone of everybody else. They need to be able to bring their valued identities, and that will often include the sorts of things that are covered by, and we use the term protected characteristics, so their ethnicity, their religion, their sexual orientation and so on, as well as their own individuality, that uniqueness needs to be part and parcel of what's accepted, what's included, and what's valued about the contribution that they're bringing to their workplace.
So it's really interesting. Would you say then that an organization's culture, if it's not, I guess, tailored towards inclusivity, it can have an impact on an individual's own kind of personality, their preferences, their traits, and how they act within the organization?
Well, absolutely, because what we find is that people cover their differences. And they will act in all sorts of ways to actually suppress that they're different. But then what that means is that you're actually going to lose the benefits of diversity, because part of the benefits of diversity is having people who are going to have different perspectives, different views, different opinions, and they're not able to speak up about those, and therefore you're not able to leverage the benefits of having more different views and perspectives. And we've, there's really clear evidence that particularly organizations where you are dependent on innovation and creativity for your productivity, you want people with different perspectives and different ideas to speak up. Because then when they have got a novel solution, a novel idea, a novel angle, that's going to be lost to the organization if people don't feel comfortable about sharing that. And so this is where inclusion has to be paired with diversity.
Yeah, again, super interesting. I think particularly when you look at diversity within the boardroom, I think it's stated that there's certainly a lack of diversity in terms of ethnicity, but also a lack of diversity in terms of male-female ratio. Yeah. And so you're getting that potential kind of groupthink where, everybody is kind of, I guess, come from a similar background, and therefore you have the lack of creativity or lack of diversity in thought as well as background, and then that can impact on essentially business strategy, business decisions.
Yes. So the evidence is really clear. There's very well-researched, rigorous evidence that the more diversity you have at senior and board level in terms of gender and ethnicity, where an organization is dependent on innovation and creativity, the more productivity that organization will have. Yeah. And you can literally measure that and across all sorts of business and economic indicators. And you're right, the other thing that you get from greater diversity is you've got better risk management. And particularly when you've got gender diversity, you get better risk management. And then you also get this avoidance of groupthink. So where everybody becomes very like-minded, and what happens is they don't listen to people who've got different views and perspectives, people who are outside that leadership group that are often trying to signal very loudly that there's something wrong, or there might be better opportunities, and minds get close to that. And so mistakes are made in terms of organizations. And so if you ever look at an analysis of what led to the 2008 crash, why the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, failed to alert economies to what the potential risks were: groupthink, not listening to contrarian views, being narrow-minded, all of that feature in that analysis.
Yeah, it's super interesting. You look at it, it's even larger than the organizational level. You go into that kind of huge I guess organization on a global scale, and how they've got that issue going all the way down through different levels, even beyond the organizations, potentially government as well. So brilliant. I think we've started to touch on the second question here, but in terms of, I guess, impact, but specifically, like, in your opinion, what impact does a lack of diversity have on an organization?
So there's usually four things, and we've covered off two of those, which is the impact on productivity. Diversity brings better risk management and less groupthink, but also it brings better talent management. So again, if you think about talent as a pool. You've probably heard of this analogy. You can either fish in a small pool or you can fish in the ocean. If you're fishing in a small pool, at some point you're going to miss talent. If you're fishing in the ocean, you're going to have a wider, better opportunity to get bigger fish because there's just more bigger fish in the ocean. So an example that I often use, I was doing some work with the European Parliament and I anonymized President Obama's early career. So they run a graduate management scheme. I said, look, would someone who had been a sabbatical officer, worked as a student union officer when they were at university, he then went into church community organizing. He helped to run a charity, church-based community charity. He then was involved in voter registration. I said, I didn't tell them it was President Obama. I just gave him his track record. And I said, would someone with that track record, would they get a place on your graduate management scheme? And they said, very likely not, because all they're interested in is people who've done internships at places like the UN, places like the World Bank. But to do those internships, they're usually for a year, they're unpaid. So only people who have got professional parents who can afford support people can do those internships. So they said no. And just think of the talent that somebody like President Obama represents. So how much talent is your organization wasting, not recognizing, not taking on, because that person has come from a different track record to your usual norm. So when we work with diversity, we start to expand the track records of the people that we hire. They end up with the same talents, but it comes from different pools. And then finally, the fourth thing that is very attractive to organizations that helps you get closer to your market, where you've got people in your organization that are representative of the markets that you're trying to serve. They understand the language, they understand what's important to them, they understand what they're interested in, how to communicate with them. And so you get a lot better than that. And you also avoid blunders that are going to put off people in your market. In the public sector, again, it's about being better able to serve your clients. If you've got people inside your organization who understand the needs of your clients.
Amazing. I think I love the Obama analogy. I think, imagine turning down someone of that caliber because, you based your premise or your thought or feeling on essentially on a piece of paper, which doesn't maybe representative the skills or potential of that individual. And there's a neat segue there into our next question, which is going to be talking about recruitment and selection. What's interesting is the synergy with the sister business to Phoenix 51, which is Raw Talent Academy that my business partner Lee set up in 2011. And that was based around the premise of essentially tearing up the CV and interviewing and selecting people based around skills, attributes, values, and behaviors. And I think that, and assessing people based around how they perform in a kind of a more of a business style or organization style simulated scenario, rather than looking at their CV and a background. And I think, that's something that's formed kind of the basis of both Raw Talent and Phoenix 51, and something we believe in wholeheartedly. And it really translates nicely to our next question, which is around recruitment and selection. So what are your experiences of how businesses approach recruitment and selection in relation to D&I specifically? Is there good, is there mediocre, is there bad out there? What's kind of what's your experience?
Right, yes. So I think there are probably three main things that businesses tend to get wrong. So firstly, and I think fundamentally, many of them are just not following rigorous best practice. So they'll do things. My ex-partner used to work in the financial services, and he would always say to me, I know when I've got a job, because the sooner to the start of the interview I can get on to talking about golf and football, the greater the correlation there is with me actually getting the job. And the worst was one of our major banks. And basically the hiring manager poked his head. This was when we still had, people in rooms doing interviews, poked his head around the door and looked him up and down and said, "You've not got two heads, you'll do." And that was the end of the interview. A colleague of mine was saying, someone was saying to her, "Look, we don't need to have a procedure for recognizing top talent. We all know what top talent looks like." i.e. they had a really stereotyped idea of what top talent looked at. So they're not even following best rigorous practice. They're just, relying on gut feel and what people look like. And so getting that in place, I think, is a fundamental. There's no way that we can manage things like unconscious biases unless we've got rigorous practices in place. Then, relating back to the Obama discussion, if we have got person specifications and situational judgment exercises, that only people that have been cloned from exactly the track record and the background of the person who has always done the job can pass or get through, then obviously we're not going to be bringing diversity in. And so I think absolutely what you were suggesting, making it about people's skills, their values, their capabilities, rather than having specific types of experience, unless they are very, very specific to a particular role. That then enables you to have people from lots of different routes applying for roles. And then obviously we have got issues around making sure that recruiters aren't affected by things like unconscious biases, but that's also from the candidate perspective as well. So you can ask questions and carry out your recruitment process in a way that people are put off. And so, for example, we were asked to carry out a debiasing audit for a client. And what we found was that one of the tasks was people had to carry out a marketing assessment of brands of pork sausages. Seems like innocuous, but obviously if you're a vegan, that question's going to put you off. People with religious backgrounds for whom pork is forbidden, that's going to put them off. And yes, have a marketing exercise, but not one that involves pork sausages. And so when we do our debiasing audits, we find all sorts of examples of questions like that are going to put candidates off, because it's not that they can't answer it, but they also get into a quandary as to whether they should say anything about the fact that they've experienced that question as biased. And no one wants to come over as criticizing the person who's hiring them in an interview. So even just going through the dilemma about, I've been affected, should I say something, uses up the client's cognitive capacities, the candidates' cognitive capacities, which they could have been spent answering the question.
Agreed. It's really interesting. We touched on this in the green room prior to the session, but I guess some of the basics in terms of what we consider from a business or organizational psychology approach are not necessarily understand the impact of even the difference between, a biographical interview, so i.e. looking at somebody's CV, versus a competency-based interview. Now, competency-based interviews are not a new concept, but what I've certainly found with organizations is that they want to undertake a competency-based interview process from a rigorous point of view, assessing against values and competency frameworks, but it's a HR-led initiative. And so the HR team will essentially execute that program, and maybe at the first stage screening, and so there's a degree of rigor that comes in, but then it might go to the hiring manager, who essentially throw the competency-based questions out the window and then go back to type, which is then just hiring in their own image.
Exactly. Yes.
And so going back to then those statistics that we talked about, it's quite shocking when you see that a biographical interview, i.e. a CV-based interview, gives a less than a 30% chance of that person working out in your organization in a year. It's quite frightening. And I do a lot of education with clients around that, in terms of they simply don't know that, and that they believe that the way they've been interviewing for the last 20 years is the right way, where actually there's a huge impact. So the first bit we find is educating them on the science behind why CBI is important. And then once they've got that, I guess, understood in a non-patronizing way, it's then moving on to that next phase, which is then the impact of diversity and inclusion through not employing a CBI process, because you're not able to detail your decision-making process from a legislative perspective if you're just hiring off a CV. Why have you made that decision? If that decision then gets challenged, there's no backup to say, well, this was the score, this is the criteria that we undertook to ensure that we made an informed hiring decision. So I think there's also legislative impacts of not following this process.
Well, and I think that's a part of it, but also your business will not perform as well if you have not hired the best people. So there was a really fantastic piece of research which was happened around the time of the 2008 crash. So previous to the crash, you probably know there's been all sorts of studies where if you send out a CV in a ethnic sounding name, that person has to apply 60 or 70% more than if the same CV is sent out in an English sounding name before they're called for interview. In this variation, what the researcher did was that they sent out actors. So the actors were all as good looking as each other, all as articulate as each other. They had a CV that was designed to be very, very similar, but the only thing therefore that differed was whether they were black, Hispanic or white. Not surprisingly, the black candidate was rejected far more times than the white or Hispanic. And then, by coincidence, the 2008 crash happened. And in New York, this is where the study happened, it was devastating. And what they found was that those businesses that hired on the basis of ethnic fit, rather than the fact that being the best person in the job, were a third more likely to go out of business than those that had hired on the basis of the best talent. Now, because this was a correlational rather than causative type study, we couldn't say exactly why, but we suggest that there are two reasons for that. The first is they just weren't hiring the best talent, and that was fine when the business environment was benign. But as soon as it became challenging, not having the best talent meant that your organization did not perform as well, and so you lost out and businesses folded. Or the senior managers were making business decisions on the basis of gut feel rather than being data-led, and therefore they were making poor business decisions, which again meant that when the business environment was benign, that was fine. There were prizes for all, but when it became really challenging, if you were making irrational, bias-based business decisions in the same way that you were making your bias-based people decisions, this is why Daniel Kahneman is very interested in unconscious bias from an economic perspective, then again, you're not making the best decisions for your business. And so managers learning not to be bias-based, but to be evidence-based, to be data-led is also really important. So, for all of those reasons, learning to leave the gut behind, to leave bias behind, and to make your decisions on the basis of data and evidence is just so important for business generally.
And do you think businesses still got a way to go in terms of making that causal link? Do you think it's still sometimes a bit of we need to cover D&I and it's more of a tick box rather than actually saying we need to cover D&I because it's going to be, it's going to secure the future of our business, it's going to make us more robust, it's going to make us more successful in the future?
Well, I think yes, because, if you're saying that, what was it? a third of people are left after a year if they're just hired on the basis of biographical. If you costed that up, I wonder how much that costs the business. That's waste, isn't it? Waste of money, waste of time, you know, the amount of time that is taken. So often people will rebel against good D&I based rigorous recruitment process because they take more time initially. But I always remember one of the things that I've learned in my life, if you buy cheap, you buy twice. And I think it's the same recruitment. Rigorous process will take more time and investment and energy initially, but they should pay off in the long run.
Interesting. I think the unconscious bias piece is obviously a hugely hot topic. One of the features the Phoenix 51 system is, you know, it allows the analytics to look at hiring manager behavior. So it allows you to identify, you know, if managers are making, you know, biased decision making against, say, you know, age, gender, or ethnic background. But it's all well and good having that data. It's then obviously what you then do with that when you've uncovered potentially where the unconscious bias may sit at an individual level or organizational level. I know that your consultancy that you do covers unconscious bias training, but there has been a quite a high profile case in the past 6 months where I think one of the chairman of KPMG stated that essentially he felt unconscious bias training was a waste of time and, you know, caused quite a lot of controversy. So I just wanted to just see what comment you've got on that.
Yeah, so the problem with unconscious bias training is it's not that they're unconscious bias. It's not important for people to understand how unconscious bias is affecting their people decisions. The problem has been in the way that people have been trained. So I always liken it to having a desire to become healthy, to lose weight, become fitter, and reading the latest fad diet. So you can finish a diet book, in a sitting over a couple of days, and then are you going to lose any weight? Are you going to get fitter? No. Actually, it only happens because you go to Weight Watchers or whatever is your equivalent every week. You follow the healthy eating plan. You do the work to help manage your stress and well-being so that you don't need to comfort eat, that you find yourself an exercise or a sport that you love and you do it regularly so that your well-being is increased and your fitness is increased. And and in the end, it only works because you recognize this is for life. And unconscious bias is like that because, you know, firstly, many of us don't recognize, a bit like diets, that every time you watch the TV, in the same way there'll be an advert seducing you to go to McDonald's or whatever, every time there is on the news an unhelpful stereotype that is reinforced, then your bias is going to be reinforced. And so I think we have to recognize that we never become unbiased. And that's why we need to commit to using the processes that help us to manage and mitigate bias and being willing to get the evidence, ideally in real time, get the data that tells us so that actually bias may have affected our decisions. We shouldn't see it as a personal failing because, again, as I said, a bit like how we're always being seduced by food adverts, bias again reinforced, not just by the media, but just by our everyday unrepresentative roles that people are in at work. That reinforces an association. So some of the organizations that are working with systems like yours, they put pauses in. Let's do the shortlisting, pause. Let's give our hiring managers feedback as to whether that shortlist is representative. Pause before we make our final decision. Let's review whether we've been talking about fit. As soon as you talk about does this person fit, our tribal brains come in. If we took all that discussion away, obviously we don't want to recruit corporate sociopaths, but apart from that, actually the value of diversity means we don't want someone who's exactly like us, who doesn't exactly fit, who's someone who might make us feel slightly uncomfortable, but if they really were the best person, then let's recruit that person. And let's, so they build in this pause as they look at the data and they look at whether in fact they are reverting to type, or whether they're managing to carry the diversity that came in at the application stage all the way through the process.
Yes, so rather than just having the statistical analysis at the end of the process, you have it at every stage. So you've almost got that sense check as you go along through the recruitment journey to make sure that, the decisions that are being made are the right ones and for the right reasons. So that makes a lot of sense. Look, Tina, we're doing really well. We've got a couple of questions to go. We're probably going to run over a little bit, but I'm happy to carry on if you are.
Yeah, I am.
So we're going to move on to opportunities for development and promotion of staff, because it's something that we talked about previously is ensuring not just a fair recruitment process, but a fair promotion process. And then you introduced me to a concept around not just it's what happens before you get to the promotion process and equality of opportunity. So could you just evolve on that a little bit?
Right, yes. So particularly in the higher education sector, I have been working with something called Athena Swan. And that was a really massive effort across the whole sector to get more women into science, technology, engineering and maths disciplines. And once they were in those disciplines, to then get them to progress. And then more recently, we've been working with that in terms of race and ethnicity with something called the Race Equality Charter. And so a lot of effort has gone in across the whole sector to make sure that promotion processes were fair and transparent. And so and a lot of this was driven by staff survey data where, they would ask staff, do you agree or disagree that our promotion processes are fair and transparent? And it would come back disproportionately that women and people from a racialized minority group would also say, no, we don't agree that they are fair and transparent. Then they would make those processes fair and transparent. And then they would wait to see whether the number of women were getting promoted. It wasn't changing. And so when they actually looked at it, partly it was about encouraging people to apply for promotion. And sometimes people who didn't feel the processes were fair wouldn't put themselves forward because they'd gone through being rejected in the past and nobody wants to go through that again. So they had to do something about making sure that people were nominating themselves or were being nominated for promotion. And in some of those cases, then people would get through the promotion because really they should have been promoted years ago. But in other cases, they recognised that by the time you got the promotion process, if people didn't have the development opportunities, the track record, the stretch projects, gone on particular business critical assignments or on business critical, there often will be top leadership training and development programs that again, in a particular organization, that if you haven't gone on that, you're not on the fast track. If in the preceding 3 years before, or 2 to 3 years before the promotion panel, candidates hadn't been on all of those types of talent, fast track talent signaling, stretch projects and training programs, they wouldn't get through. And so it's a bit like focusing just on fairness and transparency, closing the stable door once the horse has bolted. You need to start 3 or 4 years before that, making sure that your diverse talent is going to be the best candidate in 3 or 4 years' time.
Yeah. So it's not good enough just saying, okay, well, that person didn't get through the fair and transparent recruitment process because actually they wouldn't have had the fair opportunity to develop and gain the skills over a period to actually put themselves kind of in the shop window to get actually that promotion. So I think it's a really interesting causal link, one that I necessarily hadn't considered before. Yeah. So I think it's really good to bring to the debate.
There's two metrics that can help you work at this, help you identify this. So the first is that you look at the typical time it takes for a white male to be promoted in your organization, and that becomes your one. And then you compare your minority groups, whether they are less likely or more likely. And then you look at your eligible pool and you see what proportion of your eligible pool by your demographic data are being put forward for promotion or applying for promotion and getting through. And again, if that's not proportional, that gives you a clue that people are not being developed, they're not being supported. So that's why we work with organizations to set up formal sponsorship schemes. So what we find is that informal sponsorship typically happens when a senior manager sees someone who reminds them of them when they were young, strikes up a connection, and then starts grooming them for leadership, giving them advice, careers advice, making suggestions for projects, making sure that they're nominated for projects. But obviously, if senior leaders, just because of statistically, they tend to be more likely to be senior white men, that is more likely to happen with young white men. And also, to be fair, a senior man nowadays could not sidle up to a talented female and start talking about how amazing they thought their career was and how they wanted to nurture them. It would not go down well, would it, in today's Me Too? No. So again, for women, there are barriers, and across ethnicity, again, senior white men often feel that they don't know, they're really worried about saying or doing the wrong thing. And so that awkwardness, again, means that they're not going to strike up that sort of informal conversation with people across race and ethnicity divides as well. And so with formal sponsorship schemes, that relationship becomes transparent, it becomes open, and senior leaders become accountable for nurturing diverse talent. And in some organizations, they will say, well, if your protege hasn't been promoted in 2 years' time, you need to be able to explain why. So it's comply or explain becomes part of this whole process.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. And I think there's a lot. We talked about the education piece, and I think there's a lot for organizations to learn and to go on this journey. But we wanted to finish off with the last question before we go to the audience around some positivity. So in preparation for this podcast, I wanted to really get a flavour of what the global but also the UK landscape looked like for diversity and inclusion roles. And I'm pleased to say that it's now considered that the UK is at the top of the tree. It's got the most dedicated roles for diversity inclusion in any country in the world. So that was a first fantastic statistic that I saw. And secondly, 77% of those D&I roles are in management or leadership positions. So for me, I took that as showing that it is being taken seriously, or started to be taken seriously, and it's happening at a strategic level, which will hopefully change positively the culture of an organization. So yeah, I just really wanted to talk to you about, I guess, these positive statistics and how you see the movement towards greater diversity in business.
Yeah, so I think that's great, and I think they're great at it, that the investment is happening at senior levels, because often we're talking about major culture change projects, and so D&I professionals need to have the power and scope to be able to lead those effectively across the whole organisation. So I genuinely believe that for a long time in many sectors, there's been a lot of commitment, there's been a lot of goodwill, and there's been a lot of investment. But often we don't see the progress that we expect. And obviously in the US, they're often been ahead of us when it comes to this to D&I, and so much so that that some commentators have said, is it almost a cynical conspiracy? So organisation wants to be seen to be doing something, they will invest in D&I, but they often know that it's going to be a gesture rather than things actually making a difference. Is this almost a conspiracy to make sure that organisations look like they're doing something, but they really don't want to change the status quo? And so one of the leading researchers in the field actually looked into this, Caleb and Dobbin, and what they found was that actually organisations were quite genuine, but the ideas that they were getting about what to do were often led by committed individuals, but they were passion-led rather than evidence-led. They were evidence-free initiatives. And so what we need to really encourage people to do is to follow the science. We've seen this in terms of COVID-19. And I think COVID-19 has been like an assessment centre for world leaders. And we've seen that the UK has not actually passed this assessment centre with flying colours. So, you know, we need to be evidence-led, and we need to ask ourselves what works when it comes to D&I. And, you know, what we see are those are initiatives where line managers become accountable and responsible for diversity. They're initiatives where they have real connection with minorities, whether gender or race and ethnicity. And they are initiatives for which they are held publicly accountable for the outcomes. And so this is why gender pay gap reporting has had such an impact, because it's public, it's accountable. Companies can't, there's a league table. Companies don't want to be the last. And, you know, people want to look good to others. And so when we harness all of those three, we tend to find we've got diversity initiatives that work. Brilliant.
Well, I've got one key stat to hit you with before we leave. But I said my dogs might disturb us. So, yeah. Got to chuck him out in the garden. Here's an appearance from Ragnar. So, one of the key parts that we talk about is around talent attraction as well. And one of the really interesting statistics that I read is that for organisations who have established D&I credentials and established D&I team, they get a 22% increase in applications, because they're seen to be a open, transparent, modern, progressive, forward-thinking employer. So I think when we talk about ROI, there's a really key and clear stat there that if you commit to D&I, you're going to get a greater and broader range of talent applying to work in your organisation. So Tinu, thank you so much for engaging with the debate today. It's been absolutely fascinating. And we've got a few questions we're going to check to the audience.
Yes, please.
Okay, so first one we've got is around anonymising candidate applications. So do you think anonymising candidate applications is a good way to drive diversity and inclusion?
It can be. So what you need to do is to actually look at your data. So you look at the proportion of ethnic groups that have applied, shortlisted and appointed. If you find that, let's say you get 30% of applications, which if you're in a major modern city is not untypical, 30 to 40% of applications from Black and ethnic minority candidates, and then suddenly the proportion who are shortlisted goes down to 15%, then it's a real indication that bias is happening on the basis of names. And so anonymisation will really, really work. If you find that proportion doesn't dip down at shortlisting, then actually bias isn't happening on the basis of names, and so it won't have the impact that you're looking for necessarily. So look at your data first and then make the decision.
There's a supplementary question from that. There's been a big shift in the way that applications are received. So traditionally, it was an application form or a CV that gets sent through, and inherently you have a bias. If you see where somebody grew up or where somebody went to school or college or university, immediately you're forming opinions on that person.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's moved towards video submission. So what's your thoughts on that kind of transition? And then, you know, is there any dangers around people submitting a video application rather than CV?
Oh, well, I mean, this is then what happens at interviews, because people can see the person.
Yes.
And obviously there's no disguising their ethnicity at that point. And if people are going to be biased, whether consciously or unconsciously, it's going to have an impact. So again, this is where I think this real-time feedback happens. So if 50% of your video applicants are from Black or ethnic minority background, and then before you push the final decision making, you notice that you've only taken through 15% of those to the final interview, then you need to pause and reconsider. You know, and maybe run a trial where people just listen to the audio or read the audio script and see whether the recruiter's decisions change. So, and if you found that the recruiters, you did a little trial, you had a second batch of recruiters who just did the audio or just did the script, and the proportion went up, then you've got a clear indication that the assessors were being biased. And you could also get them to do some unconscious bias tests as well. So you could see if that was correlated to their decision making.
Interesting. So you can almost like compare different methods and see statistically which will be the most effective at mitigating it. That's brilliant. So we've got a person who's potentially looking to pursue a career in D&I. So what would be your best piece of advice for professionals wanting to start a career in D&I?
I do think, because good D&I starts with good rigor around recruitment and selection, around understanding organisational change management, I would be suggesting that you're either getting a fundamentals in organisational psychology or a fundamentals in HR. The other thing that I would suggest doing is to do a master's in social psychology. So much of the research around discrimination sits in social psychology. It's one of the reasons why I'm planning to put together a specialised curriculum for EDI professionals, because I think you've got to understand organisational psychology, social psychology, HR, organisational culture change, legal professional, and project management, program management. So you need to be able to do all of those things. And I don't think that there is a provider at the moment that is providing all of them.
So in the future, we may see a Tinu Cornish-based educational curriculum within universities?
Yes, that would be the goal. You know, you and I both did our organisational psychology at Hertfordshire, didn't we? So I'm in conversations with them at the moment, but we may start something earlier than that, because it takes, I think, typically 2 years to go through a university accreditation process, and I think there's a need for something earlier than that. So, you know, if anyone's interested in that, then please let me know, because then I can get back to you. You can be my pilot sample.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, look, we're going to have one more question from the audience before we finish up. So I think we did touch on some of this, but I think it's worth delving into it a little bit deeper, which is, do you believe some companies implement a D&I program for superficial reasons? And if so, does this do more damage than good?
Yes, because I think you will raise expectations amongst your staff, and then you will not deliver, and that damages morale, and that increases staff turnover. And it will, you know, there's something that we talk about in organisations, which is to do, which we call organisational citizenship. You know, most organisations don't just get what they pay for. They get this added extra because their staff are committed to them, they believe in them, they trust the organisation, they value the organisation, and so they give them 120%. When you start to renege on your diversity and inclusion commitments, you start to erode that trust and that willingness to give you 120%. And because EDI will often overlap with well-being, it will overlap with psychological safety, it will overlap with honesty and ethics. Once you start reneging on those, you start reneging on all the others, and then you get your good people leaving. You know, so yeah, it's not in your best interest to not do this well.
Yeah, commit to the program, and hopefully they'll see the benefits around. Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, Tinu, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for your time. I know
you're welcome.
But yeah, this has been the Talent Waste podcast. If you want to get in touch with Tinu, or you want to follow her on LinkedIn, it's Tinu Cornish. Myself, Chris Wimshurst, again on LinkedIn. Or if you want some more information about either our businesses, it's Sea Change Consultancy. Is that correct?
That's it. Yes.
And we're on Phoenix51.io. But yeah, thank you for listening today, Tinu. Again, thank you for your time, and we'll speak soon.
Yeah, thank you all for listening as well. And thank you, Chris, for having me.
Pleasure. All right, take care.
Bye.